Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's book presentation of the Latino Continuum in the 19th-Century Americas by Carmen Lamas. My name is Jorge Duani, and I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, Miami. And I'm happy to thank our partners at Books and Books for co-sponsoring our series of discussions of important new work on Cuban and Cuban-American topics. In particular, I appreciate the constant support by Cristina Nosti in organizing this series. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Carmen Lamas. She is an assistant professor of English and American Studies at the University of Virginia. Before joining the University of Virginia, Dr. Lamas taught at Amherst College, Columbia University, and La Salle University. She earned her PhD in comparative literature from the University of Pennsylvania, her master's in English from Georgetown University, and 2 bachelor's degrees, one in secondary English education from Florida State University, and unfortunately I couldn't find out what the other bachelor degree was, so maybe she can tell us. Her PhD dissertation, I did find out, focused on cultural history of the Virgin of Charity of Cobre and her significance for Cuban national identity between the 1830s and 1940s. Her research specializes in Latino literature in the United States from the 19th century to the present, from a transnational and hemispheric perspective, often including questions of race in her analysis. Her first book, which we're celebrating tonight, The Latino Continuum in the 19th-Century Americas, demonstrates that Latinos have been integral to the US and Latin American literary canon and history since the early 19th century. In particular, it examines how Cuban literature and the experience of Afro-Latinos and Afro-Latinas are deeply imbricated in the Latino and Latina experience. Her second book, Irene Albar, Novela Cubana, 1885-1886, por Eusebio Guiterrez, will be published this fall. This is a rescued and recovered work by a Cuban exile writer born in Matanzas who lived intermittently in Philadelphia and Charleston between 1854 and 1893. Dr. Lamas's work has appeared in prestigious journals such as Revista Hispánica Moderna, Latin American Research Review, and Latino Studies. She has also contributed chapters to the edited volumes, The Latino 19th Century and the Cambridge History of Latino and Latina American Literature. She's also written entries for the Oxford Bibliographies in Latino Studies and the Encyclopedia of Literature and Politics. Professor Lamas is the co-founding editor of Pasados, Recovering History, Imagining Latinidad, a new journal that will be published with the University of Pennsylvania Press. She's also a member of the advisory board of Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project and is a co-founder and current vice president of the Latino and Latina Studies Association. Before we proceed, let me remind you that you can submit your questions for the author by clicking on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. I'll raise as many questions as possible at the end of her presentation. And also, you can purchase a copy of the book by clicking on the appropriate button on your screen, which says Buy the Latino Continuum, etc. And remember that your purchase contributes to support a locally owned bookstore like Books and Books. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. Carmen Lamas. Welcome, Carmen.
Thank you, Jorge, for that lovely introduction. And, I'd like to thank Jorge Duani for the invitation to speak with you about my recent book, as well as Amy Correa and all of the colleagues at the Cuban Research Institute for making this presentation possible. I would also like to thank all the folks at Books and Books, especially Cristina Nosti. I grew up in Miami, and the Librería Universal, which now is no longer, and then Books and Books were an integral part of my cultural and literary upbringing. So it's quite a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. The Latino Continuum in the 19th Century Americas, Literature, Translation, and Historiography. In May of 1892, the Cuban exile Néstor Ponce de León delivered a lecture titled Los Primeros Poetas de Cuba at a meeting of the Sociedad de Literatura Hispanoamericana in New York City. Despite the name of the society and the ostensible focus of Ponce de León's talk, This meeting was not simply a gathering of friends and visiting authors from Latin America who found themselves in the vicinity of New York and who happened to love Cuban literature and the wider culture of letters in the Americas. Ponce de Leon was surrounded by fellow exiles planning revolution. In the audience sat one of the founders and a former president of the Sociedad, José Martí, who had stepped down from leading the New York Literary Society in order to organize the Partido Revolucionario Cubano. As was so often the case among 19th century Latino intellectuals and their Latin American counterparts, literary and political practices were mutually informing and hard to separate into neat categories of their own. Ponce de Leon's lecture opened with a discussion of the epic poem Espejo de Paciencia, then and now considered the first major literary achievement in Cuba. But his purpose was not to elucidate or praise the poem, as today's readers might surmise. Rather, he sought to inspire those present to join the Cuban independence movement. For inciting the poem and relating its history, Ponce de Leon was in fact inextricably tying Cuba to New York and vice versa. The history of the poem's transcription and transmission paralleling the life experiences of the many exiles present in the room. Discussing the piece did more than remind those gathered that Cubans deserved an independent nation, as evidenced by its long literary tradition. It also tied the people in the room to the political group that discovered the piece in the 1830s in Havana, Cuba, to begin with, a dissenting faction that had seen their filibustering attempts foiled by the Spanish authorities as well as the US government. While the early 19th century filibusters had failed in liberating Cuba, those who had gathered in New York to hear about the poem now had the opportunity to finish their work. It was their moment to write literary and political history, and this time they would free the island to which the poem belonged. The poem, which supposedly dates from 1608, was originally authored by Silvestre de Balboa Troya Quesada, a native of the Canary Islands who arrived in Cuba in the late 16th century and remained there until his death in 1647. Written in octavas reales that depict a group of Cubans fighting off a French pirate attack, the early modern poem had been lost to literary history for centuries until, as Ponce de Leon explained to his New York audience, it was willed to him by José Antonio Echeverría, a Cuban reformer who had recently died in exile in New York without seeing his homeland again. Echeverría had discovered the poem in the library of the Sociedad Económica Amigos del País, the leading scientific, commercial, and cultural institution in Cuba at the time. It was transcribed into the work Historia de la Isla y Catedral de Cuba, handwritten by Bishop Pedro Agustín Morel de Santa Cruz in the 1760s. Echeverría, finding the Historia in a deteriorated state, had transcribed it fully in his own hand, and when subsequently fleeing the colonial authorities, had brought this transcription of a transcription with him to New York, saving it for posterity and willing the priceless treasure to Ponce de Leon for safekeeping until it could be returned to a Cuba freed from Spanish rule. This is how Ponce de Leon found himself in front of his fellow exiles, piecing together Cuba's literary heritage as a means of planning the upcoming War of Independence, literally building the nation from abroad, as Cubans and Latin Americans alike had done since the early 1800s. Fittingly, this New York event, the poem referenced the individual who discussed it, those who heard the lecture, and finally, the text's contested transcription and transmission histories collectively represent the phenomenon described in my book, The Latino Continuum. So I'm going to go to slide 1. Share. See this. Options. Share screen. Unfortunately, I don't see the option to share screen, so I'm just going to keep reading. Under share. Yeah. Qué lástima. Qué lástima, because it was a nice presentation. Let me see. Okay, let's keep going. We tend to think of a continuum as a smooth progression from one end to the other, an arc or line without disruptions, bumps, and breaks. Yet the etymological resonances of the term provide a much richer set of connotations. Let me just try one more time. Okay, I found it. Here it is. Window, aquí vamos. Share. Perfect. Okay, there it goes. In a technical sense, a continuum is a sequence or collection of discrete yet related things. According to a standard dictionary definition, a continuum is a coherent whole characterized as a collection, sequence, or progression of values or elements varying by minute degrees. A continuum, in other words, has a lot in common with an archive. A coherent and intentional, yet somewhat haphazard whole consisting of documents, records, books, and other objects that are highly varied in their collectivity, yet unique in their material instantiations. As a simultaneously historical and imaginative archival assemblage, the Latino Continuum is vast in its reach across the centuries and inexhaustible in the possible sequences of meaning it can afford those who take up its invitation to study, suggesting that Latinos, their lives, and their texts represent a sort of identity that is not entirely Latin American and not entirely US American either, nor is it merely transnational, which is ultimately still tied to the geographic and spatial. Rather, it is a sort of identity that simultaneously occupies multiple spatialities while inhabiting and crossing diverse temporal moments. It had, to be sure, a significant hand in shaping Latinidad and Cubanidad in the 19th century and up to the present day. This intersection of geographic, political, linguistic, cultural, aesthetic, affective, and temporal juxtapositions remains largely unexamined, despite the valiant efforts of a small body of specialists who have dedicated their careers to early Latino literary recovery over the past 25 years. In the book, I concentrate on the lives and works of Cubans in the 19th century, in part because of the long-standing presence and participations of Cubans in U.S. social and political life, as well as the presence of U.S. Americans in Cuba since the 18th century, which led these authors to read the national experience of the island both directly and indirectly in relation to U.S. history. And in doing so, they also addressed both directly and implicitly the experiences of other Latin American states and other Latino groups that were negotiating and confronting U.S. expansionism, including Californios, Tejanos, and Nuevo Mexicanos, as well as Central and South Americans. In other words, to apply the term Latino to a seemingly coherent group of writers born in Cuba or of Cuban descent signals a particular intervention of my book, both political and methodological. While I construct the Latino Continuum based on Cuban lives and texts from the 19th century, my hope is that scholars of other Latino national origin groups, as well as those in American and Latin American studies, will deploy the methodological approach of the Latino Continuum to further uncover the integrated and mutually imbricated literature and histories of the Americas, one solidly emerging from the Latino experience itself. Another intervention is in the use of the term Latino is that it's a term that is explicitly rejected by a significant portion of the scholarly fields of Cuban and Cuban American studies, just as the term is also rejected by particular political constituencies defined around Cuban identity and living in the US, a disavowal silently but powerfully based on race. To be Cuban, not as a subset of, but rather than Latino, is to be quite often associated with whiteness and thereby disassociated from Blackness. The book then seeks to recover, where possible, 19th century Afro-Cuban voices and to bring new light, where possible, to historical figures silenced by the archive, but glimpsed and sometimes given voice in the body of writing recovered here. The arc of this book thus bends toward the Afro-Cuban Latino writer and political thinker Martín Modua Delgado, who envisioned potentially liberatory futures for the hemisphere. For the Latino Continuum embeds layered and complex political and literary context and overlooked histories, situated as it is at the crossroads of both hemispheric and transatlantic currents of exchange that are often effaced by the logic of borders, national, cultural, religious, linguistic, and temporal. To recover this continuum of Latinidad, so integral to Cubanidad and vice versa, which is neither confined to the US or Latin American nation states, nor located primarily within them, is also to recover forgotten histories of the hemisphere and to find new ways of seeing the past as we have understood it. Even more significantly, though, this continuum opens resources for shaping a critical Latino historiography, and in this study, a Cuban and Cuban American one. It is one that recovers not only the individuals who composed or translated the text in question, but also the actual and potential readers who played powerful roles in different stories of reception. Individually and collectively, the works that comprise this Latino historiography have much to say about the manner in which the present and past were narrated in the 19th century and about the nature of historical writing more broadly, how sources are chosen and interpreted, whose voices are privileged, and what futures are imagined or foreclosed. This is so perhaps most visibly with works of translation, which cross not only borders and language communities, but also historical moments of publication and reception. In some cases, the works under consideration had a double use in the 19th century. In the case of Miguel de Urbe Tolón, his translation of Emma Willard's An Abridged History of the United States served both as a history textbook and a language primer designed to teach native Spanish speakers English and native English speakers Spanish. Considered particularly in relation to their original function as historical narrative, such texts comprise part of a powerful and unexamined reception history, one that shows us both how both translators and their readers, regardless of national origin or site of reading, became part of a broad Latino continuum that exceeds the requirements of residency or even physical travel to the actual space of the US and Latin America itself. The travel of these historical texts reveal not only the impact that the US would have on Latin America and the hemisphere and vice versa, but more importantly, the impact that Latinos, in the examples I study in my book, Cubans and Cuban Americans, had on the US and on Latin America. For as I suggest in the conclusion, there is always a Latinx return, a phrase that captures both the physical and textual return of authors and their texts and translations to their home countries, and as was often the case, back again to the US. In addition, across all the chapters, we find Cuban authors interpolating their readers, contemporaneous and future ones, into a broad project of recognition, of witnessing often little regarded lives and experiences, traces of which are found in their creative and non-literary productions and in the fragments that make up their biographies. In short, it is through the project of archival juxtaposition across the disciplinary silos that keep US, Latin American, and peninsular historiographic sources separated that the Latino continuum emerges. In the historical interpretation of these sources and in drawing the connections that link disparate works of the various genres, novels, textbooks, historical works, opinion pieces, and journal articles, travelogues, and other texts written in Spanish and English, within the overlapping historical context of the US, Latin America, and Europe, we begin to see how the lived experiences of the writers in questions and those they represented bequeath us a truly intersectional grasp on the historical period, and one that can serve us well in an age of what is still too often oversimplified narratives of quote-unquote minoritized or marginalized histories. At the same time, while one must squarely situate events and people in the moment in which they lived and wrote, Considering along the way the places where their work was written, published, and then circulated, the reality is that we cannot but read their works and study their lives now. This temporal commonplace is not a challenge to overcome, I argue, but a source of inspiration, one that speaks directly to how the framework of the Latino continuum can allow for a more nuanced and creative interpretive work that moves fluidly across time and place, beyond the when and where of the original text, beyond the linguistic lifespan during which it was written. As I argue, go back here. I'm going to stop the sharing. Here I am. As I argue, the reader's act of interpretation, as well as their location, is also fundamental to the constitution of the Latino continuum. For what a scholar writes about a 19th century author, whether during or after the author's life, indeed, whether immediately after the writer's death, or perhaps a century later, also lies on the Latino continuum. Scholarly work and historical memory, too, comes to comprise this discontinuous, never smooth progression of Latinidad in a centuries-long dialogue, including the original author of a text, the original author's represented subjects and contemporaneous readers, and present and future readers of the scholar, and thereby the original author. As this continuum moves across time and space, it links not only past and present worlds to those future ones we have yet to imagine, but also those quote unquote worlds not to come, as Raúl Coronado has memorably called them, those histories that might have been but did not unfold, also bear on the broad historiographic project of the Latino continuum. If this approach strikes some as ambiguous or esoteric, I ask us to pause to recall the manner in which national borders functioned in the 19th century. The border between what would become the US and what was French America, Spanish America, and then Latin America continually shifted across the 19th century with the Louisiana Purchase, the Adam Onis Treaty, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, to name only a few of many fluctuating territorial demarcations of the period. Simultaneously, though, many indigenous groups and Afro-diasporic groups, such as the Cimarrones, did not recognize these borders before or after they were redrawn and moved across them at will, defying US, French, Spanish, and Mexican laws in doing so, often triggering thereby the potential for violent repercussions. Likewise, the texts comprising the Latino continuum often operated along pathways that official maps do not record. Indeed, whatever their individual politics, when these Cuban writers authored histories, memoirs, and literary texts that spoke to their experiences in and outside the US, their work entered subterranean networks of resistance that are not always recognizable when approached through well-established disciplinary lenses. As I hope this book shows, the porosity of borders, both physical and textual, continues to the present day, just as the histories of those borders continue to be negotiated, reinterpreted, and indeed lived in their consequences. Similarly, the broad practice of reading early Latino lives and works both recovers and creates histories that are pertinent to the reality of the lives and communities of Latinos today in their many manifestations. For the physical borders take on significance in part by way of their being imagined as borders, and the acts of imagination that can harden borders are ones that draw on memories and texts, fusing the past and the present, reading not only the captured ideas and feelings of historical works into the present, but also present-day emotions into the archives we have of a shared past. The particular sources that embody the Latino continuum, as I conceive it here, are housed in archives physically located in the US, Spain, and various countries of Latin America. Collectively, they comprise what can be referred to as an Americas archive, one whose Latino component demands alternative accounts of both the nation and the so-called transnational. For the Latino continuum, despite the extent to which its individual authors often represent elite perspectives across the 19th century, necessarily intersect with the history of marginalized communities in and outside the United States. The writers studied here intuitively understood this emergence of marginalized groups. They consciously sought in their work to forge national, hemispheric, and ultimately global change. At the same time, this largely lost body of literature collectively subverts some of the generic conventions related to genre that shape our understanding of the past, pressing against the constraints produced by national ideologies and their attendant literary forms. A writer such as Felix Varela explicitly disavows genre altogether in Cartas al Pidio, a philosophical religious work which he produced during a long lived experience in the US. Yet, as he well understood, this significant political and social intervention would not be recognized by his readers as such. And this important genre-crossing text, it can be read as a travel diary, an instruction manual, or a memoir simultaneously, which so clearly depicts the Cuban experience in the antebellum period, entered the dustbin of oblivion. Consequently, this continuum, comprised of the experiences, writings, and translations of and by the individuals I study, continually bears witness to the incomparable histories and lived experiences of its various actors, from the most elite beneficiaries of colonialism to the most dispossessed lives in an ongoing structure of coloniality. If a continuum implies a progression, the Latino Continuum does not make its way toward the US, nor does it move toward some essential identificatory quality, toward becoming more Latino and less, say, Mexican or Honduran or Cuban. Instead, the progression of the Latino Continuum is broadly historical, a set of dense imbrications interlocking Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States through flows of people, objects, ideas, and even affect and memories that grows in intensity across the 19th century and into the 20th century emergence of Latino as an ideological formation, arriving perhaps in the future of what may well one day be called our own Latino or Latinx century. So I have one small part to the end of the presentation. Let me bring it up. Let me bring up share screen. Great. Okay. Perfect. One more. Aquí vamos. Perfect. The book moves more or less chronologically across the long 19th century, from 1791 and the outset of the Haitian Revolution to the founding of the Cuban Republic in 1902, and examines the changing roles of translation, historiography, and literature, the novel in particular. In chapters on 5 19th century Cuban writers and thinkers, el padre Felix Varela, el poeta Miguel Teurbe Tolón, Eusebio Guiterrez, José Martí, and Martín Modua Delgado. Chapter 1, Felix Varela's Hemispheric Interventions, recovers the hemispheric interest and influences of the Catholic priest Felix Varela, who lived nearly 30 years in the United States and was nicknamed the Father of the Irish during his lifetime. In doing so, it challenges the fractured reading of Varela's archive in the scholarly literature, where he is normally studied only as an influential Cuban philosopher, his profound influence on American history having passed almost entirely without note. This chapter serves to fill this lacuna by illustrating the manner in which Varela played a key role in the U.S. Protestant Catholic debates of the 1830s and 1840s, and in the secularization of the public school system of New York City, outlining both how these debates facilitated the emergence of minority politics in the United States and simultaneously the important role of Latinos in that emergence. The chapter also illustrates the influence of Varela's U.S. experience on his intervention in Spanish American and particularly Cuban social, religious, and political life, paying special attention to his 1826 annotated translation of Thomas Jefferson's Manual of Parliamentary Practice. I argue that Varela's rendering of Jefferson's work, which highlights the way in which Jefferson's procedures actually threatened the rights of the minority, most notably around the question of abolition and also immigrant rights, exhibits a hemispheric reach and significance precisely because it was intended for Spanish-speaking residents of the U.S., for citizens of the nascent republics of Spanish America and also for Cubans living under Spanish colonial rule. Chapter 2, Latino Translations as Historiography, explores a Spanish language translation of Emma Willard's then best-selling and now classic antebellum textbook, An Abridged History of the United States. Miguel de Urbe Tolón translated the work into Spanish in 1853 during his residence in New York City. The chapter argues that when his role as the editor of the bilingual annexationist newspaper La Verdad, published in New York, is taken into account, classifying his rendering of Emma Willard's textbook as merely a translation meant for the Spanish American market cannot capture its full value or potential effect. For his translation sought not merely to translate, but to negotiate this complex cultural and political world, both for himself and for his various audiences in the US, in Cuba, in Spain, and in Spanish America. Then that Tolón's Latino rendering did its work. It offered not a transposition of one cultural world on another, but the negotiation of a single, if varied, cultural and political continuum. In a word, it offered a historiography, a study of the intersection of these national histories, of how that intersection was written out of the record, and of how it might be restored. Eusebio Guiterrez, Archival Formations and the Universal Sentiment, and Chapter 3 examines the life and writings of this important Cuban educator who lived for 25 years in Philadelphia. In this chapter, I juxtapose Guiterrez's observations about American life and culture found in his travel diaries of the 1840s with a relatively unknown translation by Guiterrez of Rudo Ensayo, a work by the 18th-century priest Juan Netwig that details the evangelization mission of the Jesuits in what is now the American Southwest, but was then northern New Spain, contextualizing the production and circulation of the multiple editions of Netwig's text in the 19th century, specifically one by the well-known antiquarian Thomas Buckingham Smith. I argue that this Latino translation in fact advocates for a constructive place for the Catholic Church in both the US and Cuba. This advocacy, however, must be understood in light of the translation's underlying racial politics. Following his source text and the political designs of the editors of the records of the American Catholic Historical Society, where it was published, Guiterrez simplistically depicts, quote-unquote, the pacification of Native Americans in New Spain as a compassionate enterprise led by morally and spiritually dedicated priests. But in his travel diary of 1888, Un Invierno en Nueva York, Guiterrez in turn transposes the spiritual enterprise to the Cuban context, in which the place of Afro-Cubans was being debated in the 1880s and 1890s, both on the island and in the US. In doing so, he envisions Catholic priests and Catholicism as agents for the quote-unquote assimilation of Afro-Cubans in Cuba's future republic, while also arguing for a parallel and positive role for the Catholic Church in fashioning a culturally integrated United States. In the face of nativist anti-Catholic voices in the US, Guiterrez proposed a Latino religious institution built in large part on racial paternalism. Modua. The Black lector forging a radical revolution directly addresses race relations in Cuba and the United States by examining the life and works of Martín Modua Delgado. Modua lived in Key West and New York in the 1880s. The first Black reader or lector in cigar factories in Havana, Key West, and New York, he labored incessantly for workers' rights on both sides of the Florida Straits. I argue that Modua's novel Sofia en la Familia Unzuazu and his translation into Spanish of John Beard's The Life of Toussaint Louverture, the Negro patriot of Haiti, reveal a concern not simply for Black Cubans on the island, but for Afro-Latinos and African Americans then living in the United States under the violence of the post-Reconstruction racism. Now, this is where Martí comes into play. I did not provide a slide on Martí because I think he would have needed 2 or 3 slides because of his amazing work and all of the work that has been done on his beautiful writings and important writings for US, Latino, and Latin American history. But I juxtapose Modua's rendition With José Martí's, or his translation of Toussaint Louverture, with José Martí's 1887 translation of Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona. Ramona speaks specifically to U.S. expansionism and its effect on Native American populations, but it does not address Cuba's pertinent question at the time, the possible role of Black Cubans in the wars of independence and in the future republic, since the indigenous population had been made extinct in Cuba through conquest, disease, enslavement, and colonization in the 16th century. It also did not address the violence experienced by African Americans in the North and in the Jim Crow South. This chapter questions the significance of each author's translation choice and the importance of the same for articulating their respective understanding of race relations in Cuba, the US, and the hemisphere more broadly. Juxtaposing Modua and Martí in this way reveals how two key figures in Cuban independence movement simultaneously unite and collide on the Latino continuum. In the final chapter, Modua's Continuum, Redeeming the Americas, it provides a close analysis of Modua's translation of John Beard's biography of Louverture. Modua completed this translation in New York City in 1883, publishing in Key West and in Havana in 1892 in his Cuban edition of La Nueva Era. Read alongside Modua's journalistic contributions of the 1880s and 1890s, both in the US and Cuba, these texts allow us further to understand the reasons Modua disagreed with José Martí's approach to Cuban independence. They also brought to light Modua's long-term belief that only full racial integration would bring true political, economic, and social equality to Cuba and to the Americas more broadly, including the US. Indeed, Modua believed not only that a leader modeled on the likes of Toussaint Louverture, and here he was thinking of Flore Crombette, could serve to protect the Americas from the voracious cultural, social, economic, political, and ideological expansionism of the US, but that the Black experience in the Americas could serve as a cultural and political model for the US itself, one that could redeem the US from its own racist origins, made conclusively evident in Modua's time by a system that codified in law a separate but equal policy of segregation. So this is my last slide. The book's conclusion, The Latinx Return, turns briefly to Raimundo Cabrera's periodical Cuba y América, which he founded in New York and then continued to publish from Havana upon his return to the island. Like Varela, Cabrera wrote extensively about Cuba and did so across multiple genres. But unlike Varela or other writers explored in this study who lived for extended periods of time in the US, Cabrera spent less than 2 years in the United States. I argue for classifying him as a Latino nonetheless, for in Cabrera's recovery of writings by New York and Floridian Cubans in his Havana edition of Cuba y América, he incorporates Cubans into the new Cuban Republic instead of leaving them on the US side of the political border. To put it differently, while he physically returns to Cuba, in his publication of these writers, he extends his and their experiences into Cuba. This act of return, I conclude, adds a new dimension to our understanding of the Latinx experience, which has historically been depicted as a one-way migration to the US or as a one-sided border crossing the Southwest and California. Indeed, I argue that the Latinx return is integral to that original experience, challenging scholars to include these comings and goings in any theorization of the Latinx experience, past, present, and future, and its concomitant impact on American, Latin American, hemispheric, and transatlantic literature and history more broadly. In other words, I argue that we must recognize how the multi-directional movement of peoples in its many manifestations across borders, geographic, temporal, ideological, aesthetic, affective, constitutes, emerges, and lies on the Latino continuum. So I'm going to pass to Jorge now, and let me, so it's end of slideshow, click to exit. Here we go, and let me share my screen. Stop sharing.
Thanks, Carmen. Yep. Unfortunately, we had some tech issues and we couldn't see some of the last slides, but I think it was very clear. I know that you prepared them with a lot of effort, but in any case, Let me remind the audience to submit your questions for Carmen Lamas by using the button at the bottom of the screen. And in the meantime, but in order to start the conversation, I wanted to ask the author if you can expand on why you chose those 5 authors, or maybe 6, as you mentioned in the end. So Martí, Modua, Delgado, Guiterrez, Tolón, and Varela. And at the end, you mentioned Cabrera. And who did you leave out?
Oh, goodness. You know, one person that I left out that was very painful to leave out was Juan Clemente Cenea, who I think very nicely fits on the Latino continuum with his Lejos de la Patria. You know, that small novel, I think it's from, goodness, when was that? 1852, I think he published that novel. Or, you know, that's a figure. I also think that Heredia was also like an early proponent. I chose Varela very purposely, and it actually it came from my experience at La Salle University with one of the brothers there, one of the Cuban brothers there, who I had lunch with him, and we talked about his work on Varela. He was retiring, and the next day we just hit a wonderful a colleague, and I get back to my office, and the students brought his entire Varela archive. So that I would write something about Varela. And I took that to heart, Brother Miguel Campos. So I took that to heart and I did that. Martín Modua Delgado emerges because of the historical misreading or one-side reading. Because there are reasons to see Martín Modua Delgado as a very complicated figure for Cuban history because of La Ley Modua, even though he died before the law went into effect. But what I realized when I entered his archive, or the works that are available to us, because many works are withheld, right? We have to get more access to some of the work in especially the Cuban archives. But what you see about Martín Modua Delgado is that he really had a very specific vision for Cuba, and it clashed with Martí. He had a really hard time after his time in New York with the New York Cubans. He really faults them for being racist and exclusionary, etc. So I really wanted to understand him, and I found this amazing translation of Toussaint Louverture and what that translation means for the Americas, right?
Okay. Can you explain the absence of Cirilo Villaverde, probably the most famous novelist in the 19th century?
He is in the book, but he is in the book in the way that Martín Modua criticizes him, because Modua read Cecilia Valdés, and he has an essay called Las Novelas del Señor Villaverde from 1892, which he published in Havana. And in that short essay, he literally tells Cirilo Villaverde that you have completely misunderstood Cuban history. You don't know anything about Black characters and the ways that you depict them. And shame on you for living in the US for 30 years and not being able to write an accurate history about Cuba in your novel. So I encourage you to read. Martín Modua Delgado was very aggressive with his pen.
Okay. The title uses the term Latino, and in your presentation, you've also emphasized Latinidad. 2 questions about that. Why not Hispanic, if that was also a competing term? And then more recently, what do you think about the term Latinx?
Thank you. Well, the reason I use continuum, because I think all of those terms fit on the continuum, right? I use Latino purposefully because of its relation in the 1960s and 70s to the Chicano movement, to the Young Lords Party, to the emergence of a term that capture more the resistance and dissidents of Latinos in the US, of different groups, instead of its tie, let's say, with Hispanic to the Spanish language, to Spain, which was a term that had previously been used, especially when it comes to the census. So there is a purposeful use of Latino. I keep Latino. In the book, I use Latina/O. In the title, I kept Latino. I'm thinking of the 19th century and the way that the term is deployed then. In the book, when I come into the present, I use Latinx.
And one comment that you made in your presentation was that the term Latino or Latinx has often been rejected by Cuban and other Latin American writers. Can you develop that point?
Well, I think, what I this I only address in the introduction. In the book itself, I just discussed the writers, but there is kind of an alignment away from Latino, as in Latino are others, right? Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans are Cubans. We're in Miami, right? There are some Cuban Americans in terms of generation, but they are separate and not necessarily part. Um, and you hear that in particular, or at least I have, from different Cuban scholars, where the term, this relation to this communal Latino identity is not part of the Cuban experience in the US, that it is separate. And that's why I wanted to highlight that in order to show that in the 19th century, Cubans really, today also, but they really cared about what was going on in Latin America. They saw themselves as part of a wider Americas. That, when Jose Marti writes, when Eusebio Guiterrez writes, when Varela was writing, he was thinking of when Modua, right? The problem, the challenge with Modua is that he wanted to base it on a foundation of Blackness, right, in the Americas. And that's why he got so much pushback from Tomás Estrada Palma, etc., right? And so this concept of the Americas and Latinidad and the Latino experience, especially in the US, should not be a challenge, but it still continues, this kind of exceptionalist. And I think to be on the continuum, you can be completely Cuban or Mexican American or Puerto Rican, but also see an alignment with other Latinos in the US in order to bring about political change.
Wonderful. Let me ask you one final question on my part before we turn to some of the questions from our audience. Can you tell us a little bit more about Eusebio Guiterrez and his novel, since you're publishing that Recover novel shortly?
Yeah. So Eusebio Guiterrez is the Guiterrez family is one of the most famous families in kind of Cuban genealogy, because of all of the sacrifices they made in the 19th century in particular, and of course into the 20th as well, but also because of the impact that they had on Cuban education. So Eusebio had two brothers, Pedro Jose and Antonio Guiterrez, and the three of them founded, it was really Pedro Jose and Eusebio. Later, Antonio takes over the school, founded La Empresa in Matanzas, Cuba. And it was kind of the answer to the lack of education that the colony, right, Cuba, was experiencing from Spain. And Eusebio Guiterrez literally wrote all the textbooks. These are the libros de lecturas that I showed in the slide. And they were all published in the US, in Philadelphia. And then he published the last one in Matanzas, Cuba. And they became books for all of Latin America. But this is the deal with Eusebio Guiterrez. He was, I'm still trying to figure him out, his politics. Maybe it's not fair, right, to try to put him in a box, because he's hard to put in a box. Because a novel like Irene Alvar, that circulated in Spain, it circulated in France, and it circulated in Cuba and in the US, kind of has this paternalistic tone to it. But then Gabriel Reyes is trying to figure out social, which is another novel that he left, is trying to figure out kind of the future for Cuba. That's another novel that needs to be kind of, printed. But what is really fascinating about Eusebio Guiterrez is that he dove into US Catholic life. He was asked to translate for the Archbishop in Philadelphia. We have yet to recover the activities, many I'm sure, that he took part of with the Catholic Church and against nativist thought, against Catholics in the US in the 1880s and 90s. So he was a big apologetic for the Catholic Church in the US.
I was reading at some point about him because he seems to have converted. No, he didn't really, it wasn't very Catholic as a young man. And then in the US, apparently he converted to Catholicism and became very militant in the church.
Yeah, and he details his conversion, as we know from Laura Guiterrez's introduction to his biography in the records of the American Catholic Historical Society of Philadelphia. When he publishes Crudo Ensayo, he's has been deceased for a year. He dies in 1893, and it's published in 1894. And Laura Guiterrez gives us his biography. And what happened to Eusebio is that he lost multiple children, right? And early on, The Cuban kind of what are called nationalists, right? The reformers of the 1830s and 1840s. Felix Varela in Cartas al Pidio is writing to them because he's worried that they're turning to Protestantism because of all of the abuses of the Catholic Church sending very like staunch Catholic pro-Spain priests to Cuba. And so in Cartas al Pidio, he's admonishing the Cuban young people to be wary of leaving the Catholic Church, and mainly to not believe that the US is really, that there's a separation between religion, right, and the state. He says it is a misnomer. And he goes into this long, nobody reads Cartas al Pidio, this long explanation of all the different Protestant denominations and what's wrong with them, right? And why it wouldn't work for Cuba. And Eusebio Guiterrez was part of that young group that was questioning Catholicism because of Spanish intervention, right, in Cuba. But he has this moment of conversion in Philadelphia where he details the different churches that are still there that he visited and all the different languages, right? There was German, Italian, and finally an Irish priest. And he returns to the faith, and he has this moment that he goes back to Matanzas, and he's finally able to worship in the church that now has taken him back because he has returned to the fold.
Fascinating story.
Yeah.
So let's turn to some of the questions that we have for you in the Ask a Question feature. Maria Wendell wants to hear a little bit more about how you came to write on this topic, and also how accessible were the sources that you had to work on for your archival work.
Thank you. Hi, Maria. Thank you. This topic came about, I think, from my own experience of being kind of on the Latino continuum. Many of you know that I'm Cuban. I'm from Camagüey, and I came to the U.S. when I was 7. And I was just trying to understand, our history and these figures that we forget. And most of all, kind of our families' histories, right? Where we have so many of us have poets in our family that just write, or novelists. They never publish their novels, or they're published independently. And the significance of recovering these lives. But Felix Varela in particular, Felix Varela in 1853, he dies alone in St. Augustine. Just this painful moment in U.S. and Cuban history, because of all the U.S. owes Felix Varela for all of the work that he did in New York as the father of the Irish during this moment of violence against Irish Americans, right? And so I just wanted to recover those figures, and they kind of fell into place. There were many that I could have addressed, but based on this voluminous archives, what Cubans and Cuban Americans have done is that they have retained their archives. So if you go to the Cuban Heritage Foundation, Yale University, the Beinecke Library, Harvard Universities, because they have multiple spaces, the New York Public Library is an amazing resource. In Cuba, it's the Archivo Nacional. And then there's also archives in Spain, and not necessarily just the Archivo de Indias, right? Because you have to trace Spanish military history in the 19th century to really capture what's going on in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines.
Thank you. So another question from Ada Ortuza Young goes back to the term Latino, which he notes is a 20th century ideological and political term to refer to Cubans at the time when this term was not often used. Mm-hmm. So do you think, she asked, that Martí would have understood this usage and even identify with this?
No, I'm not going to go into Martí's head, but I think that Martí would have appreciated the term, because I think Martí was very sensitive to the realities of living in the U.S. And I think Martí would have seen that you can be Cuban and Latino at the same time. And I think Martí was interested in having coalitions with workers and with individuals across the Americas. And so, yes, I think that he would not have had a hard time.
Okay. And then from Kenya Dworkin, she was wondering about someone like Emilia Casanova de Villaverde, or any other women journalists or writers who were living in New York at the time in the late 19th century.
Hi, Kenya. Thank you so much for being here. So, one of the persons I write about is Miguel Teorbe Tolon's wife, right? That we don't have, apart from the beautiful film by Luis Perez Tolon, right? We really don't have a lot about her life. But this woman was amazing. This woman is considered the first, the wife of Miguel Telve Tolon was considered, Emilia was considered the first woman to be exiled, right, from Cuba. And she comes to New York and she finds out that Tuerbe Tolon was probably with the woman he married, Jean, right? We don't have the details of that yet, but she divorces him in a New York court, right? This is an amazing woman. She had fallen in love with someone in Matanzas while Miguel was gone because she was 13 years younger than him, right? And then she goes and she marries. She can't, they won't annul her marriage in the Catholic Church. So she goes and marries the guy she's in love with in Savannah, Georgia, which was somebody who would become the head minister for the Confederacy. And she marries him. And then finally, after Miguel dies, goes and marries in the Catholic Church now in New Orleans, and then she returns to Cuba. And so I think there are women to be recovered. Laura Guiterrez, the great translator of Raimundo Cabrera, is also someone to be recovered. And so we find the traces of their writings. These are male figures that I look at because the archive was very accessible. But I hope that scholars will see these intersections. Miguel Teurbe Tolon's daughter died in 1871, probably in a reconcentration camp. So even though it's tuberculosis, we want to know what happened to her. She was Cuban American. What happened to her in Cuba?
Okay, I wonder if you can say a little more about the interaction between Cuban writers in New York and Puerto Rican writers like Schomburg and later on, well, I know it's not in your period, but Bernardo Vega, Jesus Colon, etc. So that emerging, well, at the time that you are covering, you would have had people like Hostos, Eugenio Maria de Hostos. So
Right.
did you encounter any information about that Cuban-Puerto Rican interaction in New York in the late 19th century?
Yes, I did, but I didn't concentrate on it. I think the person that very clearly is doing that work right now is Jesse Hoffnung Garskov. He's probably spoken. I don't know if he's spoken at Books and Books, and his beautiful book, Racial Migrations. That is, a text that reaches out to some of those connections more clearly. So even though they were there, I did not enter deeply into, the work. Schomburg, as we know, detested Martin Modua Delgado, right? Called him a traitor to his race. So these kind of interactions occur, but I didn't follow the footsteps.
Okay. I have, I think, one final question because we don't have any more from the audience. Uh, can you reflect upon the choice of Spanish or English or both in the writing of the authors that you cover, or is it all Spanish language?
No, all of the authors wrote in both languages. So, Felix Varela, as we know, talks about how difficult it is for him to speak English. He learns it, but he doesn't like the sound of it. But Felix Varela founded literally close to a dozen newspapers in New York in English on behalf of the Catholic Church, right? Miguel Teorbe Tolon publishes English language poems in the Waverly in Boston. Eusebio Guiterrez, he was just, they moved, he wrote translators to help people learn English and to learn Spanish. Martin Modua Delgado is the only one that we find, Martí, as we know, he could manage the languages, very well. But Martín Modua Delgado is the only one that I have found mainly writing in Spanish. I mean, what he does now, he was an autodidacta, so he taught himself how to read and write, and that, he became this eminent intellectual, really on his own druthers, as they say. Right.
Okay. I see there's, I think, a final question. Let me look it up. and see if we can. Oh, here's a question from Maria Barrera. What is the next step in your research on this subject?
Oh, thank you. Hi, Maria. How are you? I think the next step is I'm going to work on Cuban costumbrismo, and then also costumbrismo across the Americas in order to understand the genre, right? Not in relation to nationhood, right? Not in relation to the nation state, but in relation to what it tells us about the Latinx experience. How does it change? As we know, it comes from England to France to Spain, and then it comes to Cuba and Mexico and Peru, etc. So if we trace in newspapers written in the US, these costumbrista pieces, what do they tell us about the 19th century and these connections? How do they shift? How are they different from the national origin ones? That's where I'm at.
Great. Well, our time is up, but thank you again for your very incisive responses, and thank the audience for their questions. Remember, you can order a copy of Carmen's book, The Latino Continuum and the 19th Century Americas, by clicking on that ribbon in your screen. And thank you again for everyone for participating in this virtual book presentation. We hope to see you soon in person, perhaps in the next few months. So good night, everyone. Thank you.